Good morning. I'm Father Tom Malionik, and I'm the rector of St. Paul's Church in Kinderhook, New York. And welcome to the 100th episode of Morning Musings. This is quite a milestone for us. We started 100 of these segments ago, just trying to get a little bit more of a handle on some of the things that were cropping up in our recitation of morning prayer together. And I began in the beginning thinking that I really didn't have a whole lot to say, but that every so often there was something I wanted to comment on, and I have found that I have way more to say, and actually probably too much to say. So over this period of time, I've gotten a little bit better at running the technology, and I've gotten a little bit better at incorporating other resources into these morning musings, and I have also learned that I need to spend a little bit more time than I actually have, really trying to prepare and execute these segments in a way that is going to be of the greatest benefit to you. So we are here today to, in a sense, say hello and goodbye. This is like the odometer on your car rolling over some nice round number like 200,000 miles or something. And on the one hand, you've left the 100,000s behind, and we're going to be starting with the 200,000s, if you will, or the 100s, the century mark. And we'll be starting that over again in a few weeks. But this will be our last time together for a little bit. And I have to, we'll talk about that as we get on. There are a lot of milestones today, and again, just as we always do, all of these things that we talk about, all of these things that we bring up, they really are all, we want them at least to be opportunities to take advantage of what God has placed before us, what God has offered us, given us, sometimes through this marvel of telecommunications that we have in the internet and so on. But all of these things are there for us so that we can grow as Christians, so that we can grow as not just disciples of Jesus Christ, not just recipients of God's blessings and benefits, but also so that we can be God's agents, God's apostles, God's ministers, prophets, teachers, whatever gifts we have been given, whatever assignment we have from God, to be able to go out into the world and to live that out, and to do it in a way that is transparent and pervades all of our lives, so that we're not living fragmented lives, partly Christian over here and partly indifferent to Christianity over here. We want our lives to be thoroughly permeated by that life of Christ, so that when people see us in any circumstance, in any situation, no matter what it is we are doing, they can see us, and they can see not just the surface of who you and I are, not just our own individual identity, but look past that, through that, into us, to see Christ alive within us, living out through us the life of God into the world. And that's what we want. We want people to see not us, but Christ living in us, and having looked at us, as it were, as icons, and seen through us as icons. They see Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God. Having seen him, they see the Father. That's the connection that we're put here to make. And we've been given all of these wonderful means of grace, all of these opportunities to take whatever we happen across as not something that is random, and not something that is arbitrary, and certainly not something that is accidental, but that has been deliberately and purposefully given to us for a reason, for our growth, but again, growth not only for our own sake, but growth so that our contemporaries and generations yet to come can benefit from our having lived our Christian life. So that's what we're doing, and even as we celebrate, some endings and look forward to some beginnings, that's still all part and parcel of what we do. Another thing that has rolled over on the odometer, if you will, is C.S. Lewis's wonderful Narnia series, the Narnia Chronicles. He started out wanting to write one book and wound up writing 9. or is it seven? Seven, and then a prequel, I guess. And it just kept kind of snowballing, if you will, going and going and going. So today marks the 70th anniversary of the release of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I don't know why this has got me choked up, but it does. Anyway, there's just a little commemorative video, and I'm going to play that for you. It's very brief. It's only about 4 minutes, but I'll play that for you now, and just so that you can, if you haven't had the pleasure or the blessing of reading these books, you really should. They're classics, and they're classics of allegory. They're classics of apologetics. They're classics of fantasy storytelling in the very best sense of the word. So here we go. Okay, don't know what's happening there. If you'll give me a moment, I'm going to see what's happening. Okay, well, I guess we're going to have to chalk that one up to experience. There is a link to it. If you go to the text header for this video, there is a link to that. You should play that and you should watch that yourself. And maybe this is because God has other things we want to talk about today. We have a lot of endings today. We have just finished the book of Jonah yesterday, and we are beginning now. We've rolled over into Ecclesiasticus. The wisdom of Sirach is another name by which that book of the Bible is known. And this is part of what we call the wisdom literature. And the wisdom literature are not the historical books. They are not the law of Moses. They are not the prophets. Those are the major divisions. The law of Moses and the prophets, the law and the prophets. You hear Jesus talk about this. They have the law and the prophets. That means the Bible. That means all of what was known as the scriptures in the time of Jesus. What we even know, even as the Hebrew Bible, was not really compiled in that sense until a couple of centuries later, after Jesus, and the full text was sort of set by excuse me rabbinical authority. We have the law, the prophets, and then the various writings, some of which are historical, some of which are literary, and some are what we call the wisdom literature. That would be things like this book, Ecclesiasticus, Sirach. It includes Proverbs. It includes Ecclesiastes, confusingly similar name. Ecclesiastes is the book of the preacher Koheleth. We read through that earlier this year in our recitation of morning prayer, and now we're in Ecclesiasticus. And some of, depending on, and there are other works of the wisdom literature, which, depending on which manuscript tradition you start out in, they're either rolled into other books like Daniel, or they appear separately as separate stories. Like, for example, the Song of the Three Young Men, the story of the three young men, sometimes winds up in Daniel, sometimes winds up as a separate piece. Another story called Bel and the Dragon, and so on. And not all of these works were even included in the scriptures that were used by Jews in Palestine. And when the Protestant Reformation came along, that was the standard that the reformers took for which biblical works, which biblical books should be considered authoritative, should be considered inspired, and should be considered part of the canon of Scripture. Other Jews who had migrated to other areas had other books like this one, like Ecclesiasticus, the Wisdom of Sirach, and used that. And they are called deuterocanonical books, that is a secondary canon, a second tier, if you will, of authoritative writings. And they're distinct. Some of them only exist, for example, in Greek. Some of them only exist, like portions of Daniel, only exist in Aramaic and not in biblical Hebrew. And so so they were not universally adopted in Judaism, and when the Reformers came along, they thought that would be the standard. However, these other books have a long history of use, both by the early Christian communities, by the fathers of the church, and so on. And so finally, the way we deal with these books is we read them not because they are considered divinely inspired or that they establish doctrines. They can be used to establish doctrines, but rather that they are inspiring works. They're works that certainly are clearly harmonious with the rest of the Bible. They are certainly congruent with the message and the teaching of other parts of the Bible. But then there are pieces of them that turn out to be somewhat problematic. We have, for example, intimations of say, purgatory, the doctrine of purgatory, which the Roman Catholic Church happily continued and developed and finally professed as a substantial portion of Catholic teaching, of Catholic doctrine, and based again largely on what occurs in these secondary writings, because the Catholic Church accepts them all as inspired scripture. The Orthodox churches, the Eastern Christian churches, accept all of those and even a few more as authoritative canonical scriptures. But so we're going to read. We're going to be reading in morning prayer through books like Ecclesiasticus, or also known as the Wisdom of Sirach, and we will read through them, and we'll read through them precisely for what they say they are, for wisdom. That wisdom is a perfectly good thing to have as a Christian, and think of them, if you will, as works of philosophy. And this is something that we tend not to pay a lot of attention to. I think philosophy strikes us as sort of, Socrates and ancient Greeks and Plato and Aristotle and so on, and arguments over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Thomas Aquinas and so on as a philosopher. But the thing is, we all have a philosophy. We all have a sort of bounty, or thesaurus, or what's the word, a corpus, a body of wisdom that we draw on. And the only difference, I think, between us and those classical philosophers is that we sort of stumble across some little aphorism or some pithy saying and so on, and adopt it as a basis for our behavior without really exploring it in any depth, without really testing it, without really pushing it to see how far it actually goes before it breaks down and no longer becomes useful. And so we wind up governing our lives by principles that really should be much better tested. And we wind up defending those principles just because we've staked our identity on them. And it puts us at odds with others, and it deprives us, though, because we have not really thought about them, and because others have not really thought about them, or even thought about how to think about them, that we find ourselves in arguments over details and over consequences, when what we're really disagreeing about is the fundamental presuppositions, the fundamental assumptions that we're making. Are they valid? Are they justifiable? And on what basis? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the philosophical realm, and I think probably better communicated to us as individual Christians. That doesn't mean it has to be arcane, and it doesn't mean it has to be just impossibly elaborate, but that there is such a thing as wisdom, and that it needs to give an accounting of itself before we adopt it as a basis for living. So we are finishing Jonah. We're going to dip into this wisdom literature for the next. I didn't even look to see how long the readings from Ecclesiasticus last. It's at least a week. It's a fairly long book and a fairly complicated book, but we'll be dipping in occasionally into the wisdom literature, in addition to the law and the prophets. We'll get back to the prophets as well, by the way. But of course, we're also reaching the end of the liturgical year. This is our last 6 weeks in the year of grace 2020. The year of grace 2021, so the next liturgical year, begins on the first Sunday of Advent, which is October 31st, I believe. October 31st will be the first, no, I'm sorry, November 29th is the first Sunday of Advent, not October. November 29th is the first Sunday of Advent. So we have between now and then to sort of wrap up this year's set of readings of the Bible before we start a new cycle. The new liturgical year always begins on the first Sunday of Advent, which means it begins in the previous calendar year from the year we're talking about. So we are now in year A of our Sunday liturgical cycle, and beginning on November 29th, it is the 29th, right? Handy dandy liturgical calendar. Let me know if you want one. Yes, it is going to be November 29th, the first Sunday of Advent. So November 29th, the first Sunday of Advent begins year B. So now we're going to leave on our Sunday readings. Of course, during the Advent and Christmas season, we draw from a variety of other specialized sources. But once we get into the ordinary, into the regular season after Pentecost, we'll be reading mostly from Mark's Gospel rather than Matthew's. So we're going to, year A is Matthew, year B is Mark, year C is Luke, and John gets sprinkled in special times of the year and at other seasons. And then for the daily office, we use a 2-year cycle in even-numbered years. We're in 2020 now. In even-numbered years, we use cycle 1. And in even-numbered years, we use cycle 2 because 2 is an even number. In odd-numbered years, we use cycle 1. So beginning again on the first Sunday of Advent, 2020, which is the first day of the liturgical year 2021, we start with cycle 1. So we'll be using the readings from the first cycle of daily office readings. But anyway, we are wrapping that up, and we're also wrapping up today. We won't see it again. Our reading from the Acts of the Apostles. Paul has been blown off course. He's been delayed not just for the amount of time it would take to get back on course, but they're traveling at a season of the year when the Mediterranean is not a hospitable place, and for all that we think of it as just a big lake, it isn't. It's a sea, and it's a pretty stormy sea at that. So rather than just putting into port occasionally, we're talking about spending, an entire winter in port, 3 months, a whole season, and now this last episode has ended in shipwreck. They have actually their hope, after having been blown way to the southwest, if you recall that map from yesterday, they've been blown way to the southwest, almost to the coast of Africa, past Libya, and now they have tacked their way back up towards the island of Malta, which is closer to Italy, but that's where they have landed, and it's going to take them a while. It has taken them a while to be able to get back on the road again, and that's kind of like where we are. I think we thought we were on a fairly straightforward journey, and we were going to be putting one foot in front of the other, and that we would be somewhere else than where we are right now, from having just gone, in a straight line, or at least following the path that we expected. And we thought when all of this started that we would be delayed by no more than a couple of weeks, and at most a couple of months. But as it turns out, we are like Paul. We've been blown off course for an entire season. It's been 6 months that we have been at this, learning how to do things differently, learning a different language, like Paul on Malta, right? Yeah, except not all the people are quite as kindly as the Maltese seem to have been to Paul and the rest of the crew and passengers on board that ship. But regardless, wherever we have landed, we can still We can't do the same things that we used to. We can't go back to doing what we used to do, but we can still do what God wants us to do. We can still preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. We can still heal. We can still pray. We can still worship God. We have to do it under different circumstances, and we have to do it with different aesthetic surroundings. But it is still God that we worship, and it is still we who worship, and it is still worship. And it's not dependent on styles or decor or music or anything. It is still the people of God taking whatever it is that we have, like the Jews that were deported from Israel and from Judah, who find themselves in a foreign land, unable to sacrifice in the temple, but they keep up whatever they can keep up. They can't go back to the temple any more than we can go back yet into the church in the way that we're accustomed to. But nevertheless, we keep up what we can keep up and do what we can to preserve, if not the actual practice, then at least the memories and at least the heritage, the tradition that has been passed down to us, not so that we can look at it and decide we don't want it anymore and throw it out, but so that we can preserve it if necessary and then hand it on to a new generation. That's what we've been given to do. So we are, in a sense, we're a lot like Paul. We've been blown off course. It has delayed us way more than just the couple of weeks that the storm lasted for them. It's way more than the couple of weeks that we had that were where coronavirus and COVID-19 were novel and unpredictable, and death tolls were high and infection rates were high. We're seeing now, again, sporadic spikes and increases in those sorts of things. That's just what we have to cope with. But we will bloom where we're planted, if you will, and we will. We will continue. We will not only survive, but we will thrive. We just won't look like we used to look. That's really kind of it. It's going to be different weather. The weather will be different. The people will speak a different language. We will have to dress and conduct ourselves differently. But nevertheless, we're still God's agents. We're still God's instruments. We're still God's beloved people sent on mission to accomplish what Jesus set out to accomplish, which is to communicate salvation to all the nations of the world, to all the people around us, and again, to future generations. So that's another ending, if you will. It's an ending of a way of life. It's an ending of Paul is not going to be going back. He's not going to be going back to Palestine. He's not going back to Jerusalem or Asia Minor or to the Balkans, to Greece. He's never going to be going back there. He doesn't really necessarily know that. He had wanted to keep going past Rome even, but even that path is going to be closed to him, and he will wind up staying in Rome, but that's not going to stop him from being himself. It's not going to stop him from preaching under different circumstances, in a different language. It's not going to stop him from taking up more writing as opposed to simply doing things in person. He's going to adjust the way he does things, but it will still be the same mission and the same message that he delivers. So other endings. Today we celebrate another set of endings, if that's not too flippant a way to put it, but the end of the so-called Oxford Martyrs. Thomas Cranmer, Nicholas Ridley, Hugh Latimer. They were burned at the stake as heretics in an England that had swung back to Catholicism under the Queen known as Bloody Mary, which in British English is a pun. But after having been really active and engaged in the somewhat wrenching reconfiguration and reformation of the church under Henry VIII and Edward VI, find themselves now back in an environment that has shifted yet again back to back to Catholicism that is inhospitable to the ideas of the Protestant Reformation as it had been instigated by Luther, by Calvin, by Knox, all of the various different reformers. All of their ideas percolated up and got into England, and they were adjusted, and they got adapted, and some of them were uniquely reconfigured to match sort of the British situation. Cranmer was instrumental in this. He was one of the moving forces. Latimer and Ridley were just local bishops who were sincere as reformers, but they were rather gentle souls, and they didn't have as much of, I don't think, a reform agenda. I guess it was Latimer who had pushed back when he was told that he could not institute some of the reforms in his diocese, but nevertheless, Cranmer is sort of the major figure of the three of them. They're all major figures because of their martyrdom, but Cranmer had a bigger role in, I think, bringing the Reformation to bear upon the Church of England, the Church in England, which became the Church of England. And Cranmer was Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the head of the whole southern province of the Church of England. The other province is the York province in the north. But Cranmer is more controversial. He was much more driven by a desire to reform, and Reformation theology and ideology really just it seized upon him, and he was energetic about it. He was filled with the Spirit about it, but he was also fiercely loyal to Henry, and Henry, of course, himself had fancied himself to be a theologian. Cranmer was so loyal not just to Henry, but to the idea of loyalty to the monarch on the part of the church, that he got kind of all tied up in Henry's obsession with a male heir, and that affected, of course, how the developing situation in the Church of England, how the Church of England came to think about itself as church, separate from what had been passed down to it from medieval Roman Catholicism, how the church is organized, what is the nature of the church, what is the relationship of church to secular society. Even the sacramental theology of the church, it was, the reformers had a different take on sacraments. They believed that Jesus had only commanded two in particular, and they being baptism and whatever they viewed as the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or communion or whatever. Matrimony may or may not have been among the sacramental acts. The Roman Church took not just direct command by Jesus, but also his sort of association with and blessing of other types of sacramental acts as sacraments. So matrimony, Jesus did his miracle at the wedding at Cana. We just heard him talk about the parable of the wedding feast and so on. That weddings were somehow an important thing, and marriage is a sacrament for Roman Catholics and for some others. But Cranmer got kind of caught up in all of that, and Cranmer over time he was working through some of this stuff, and he wasn't just sort of on a roll with the Reformation. He went back and forth about many of these issues, and at some points recanted some of the things that he had said about the Reform, and then recanted those recantations, and kind of went back to a Reform viewpoint, and so on, until he finds himself, unfortunately, under Mary, the Catholic Queen, who's bringing the church back into union with Rome, and he finds himself on the outs with that, and in the end finds himself condemned for heresy, sentenced to die, to burn at the stake, after having once signed one recantation, and now at his execution he recants his recantation of his recantation of his recantation. it gets complicated. It's better to read it than for me to explain it to you. But it is a long and it's a complicated story. Many of the condensed versions that you hear leave out a lot of the important details and nuances. There is again, book which I think about it. I would have left you a link to it. Diarmaid MacCulloch wrote a sort of definitive biography of Thomas Cranmer, and scholar Ashley Null has done some wonderful work on his theology as well. So you might want to check out those. If you like biographies, MacCulloch's biography of Cranmer is excellent. So we have an ending to the Oxford Martyrs. We have the beginning of Sirach. We have Morning Musings now, not coming to an end, but taking a break. And maybe when it returns, we'll have a different name. I don't know. My plan is to follow along with all of the rest of the clocks that tick and the calendars that roll over, and pick up again with the Morning Musings on Tuesday, December 1st, when I hope to have something that will partly accompany us through Advent, but watch for details on that. And I don't know whether it'll be exactly the same, whether it'll be 10 o'clock every single morning of the week, or whether it'll be less frequent, whether it'll be simply videos released a couple of times a week on YouTube. I think I'm going to have to give that a lot of prayer and thought. And I would appreciate your input. Again, tell me what's working. Tell me what's good. Tell me what is helpful to you, so that we can focus on doing what will be indeed nourishing and inspiring and saving, and will equip you again to serve God best. But meanwhile, we are also, again, still like Paul in that stormy Mediterranean, heading into some fairly turbulent waters as a church and as a country. We have a very hotly contested presidential election coming up. We have our diocesan convention coming up. We have the unknown fate of our own bishop. We don't know what the consequences will be for our diocese or for our parish. We don't know a great many things. We are feeling our way through. We are groping our way through. And that's not a bad thing. Waiting is hard. The temptation, the urge, the yearning, the desire to go back to the way things used to be is really, really strong, and I understand it, and I get it. It isn't always possible. Even if we go back to a changed landscape. We go back to having to do things differently. We can't recover everything that we miss or that we feel we have lost. And it isn't really lost. It's just that its usefulness for us now, at this time and place, is changed. And that we have to address our current circumstances and our current situation with new and creative thinking. And if we are constantly, overwhelmed by anxiety and grieving and loss, we won't have the creativity that we need in order to move forward with faith, with fidelity, with loyalty and obedience to God. We may panic and go running off in some new direction, but without the wisdom that we need in order to do that in a way that will still keep us serving God, that will still keep us serving not our own appetites, not our own preferences, not our own desires, but that will still keep us serving God. We just can't even begin to speculate what things are going to look like. We can formulate a strategy, we can formulate a plan, and then we will have to keep adjusting and readjusting that plan as we go forward and as things develop. It's just the way things are going to have to be. And the waiting is hard. It is hard. And in the meantime, if we seem to lack the resources that we need in order to do what we want to do, then we may have to reconsider what it is that we want to do, and really again, go back not to some sort of practical problem-solving mode, because these are problems we can't solve. But rather than go to a problem-solving mode, we need to go back to a prayerful, discerning mode. And in that discerning mode, say, okay, God, this is what we want, but what do you want? Right? I would like this cup to pass from me, but what's your will? What will serve you? What will make us the best servants? What will make us the most fruitful agents of your will in the world? And if we lack something that we think we need, then we may need to reconsider what we're trying to do. Maybe because it's not in God's plan. Maybe it's because we've allocated resources in the wrong places. Maybe it's because we need to pare back. Who knows? But we need to apply ourselves prayerfully to that, and not simply on the basis of sort of secular, practical, worldly knowledge. We need to draw on divine wisdom. We need to draw on surrender and submission to the Spirit of God, not to trying to take our own will and recast it as if it were God's will. We won't be able to go back. With that, I think today's collect was, I think, particularly telling. It's one that we say every Friday morning at morning prayer, and it has that bit of wisdom in it that I think is important. If you recall, the collect is, Almighty God, whose most dear Son went not up to joy, but first he suffered pain, and entered not into glory before he was crucified. Mercifully grant that we, walking in the way of the cross, may find it none other than the way of life and peace. Through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord. Amen. That's you can go bookmark that for yourself if you want. In the prayer book, it's on page 99. But that point, that walking in the way of the cross, that the way of the cross is the way of life and peace. That those who try to save their lives, those who try to keep from losing, those who try to preserve, to hang on to cling to what they even believe to be theirs, are going to be the ones who, in the end, find it is A, wrenched from them anyway, and B, they're unable to cope with that. But those who are willing to let it go, not that I want to canonize, Disney's Frozen, but letting it go, there's wisdom, because God saves and preserves for us the blessings that we feel like we're relinquishing at the moment. But we either get them back or we get back something far better. And I think that's the message for us, is that we have to be unafraid to let go of the familiar, of the comforting. We have to let go even of our own self-concern and self-absorption, and trust that God will take care of us, albeit in new and exciting and surprising and unforeseen ways, miraculous ways. God will do that. We have had in the past month or two several four-figure donations out of the blue to this church. They're not enough to cover what we ordinarily would want to do, or what we ordinarily are the financial obligations we feel we already have. But they are a sign that God is ready to come to our aid, even from unforeseen sources. And that's an important message to us. That's an important thing for us to consider. God is signaling to us that we will not be left abandoned, and that it is not simply up to us to keep doing what we've always been doing and expecting different results, or that we are the ones who have to make things happen, or that we have to find somebody to put in charge of making things happen so that we have somebody to blame and we don't have to do the work ourselves. It is up to all of us to contribute to this process of prayerful discernment. I guess maybe this is a good time, and I'm going to do this, seeing as this is our last installment for a while. But I want to give you an example of the kind of hope that God can put in our hearts. And this comes from a time in my life when I was very new to Christianity. Maybe I had been a believing Christian for not quite 10 years at that point. I spent the first few years of my Christianity truly coming to grips with my own sinfulness and learning to receive and to accept God's mercy as mercy, and not to have to try to think of myself as good, or not to have to think of myself as good enough, but instead to accept mercy as God's gracious and undeserved favor in my life. And that's what contributes to this ongoing sense of joy and gratitude. But I had been a Christian for, I'm going to guess, maybe 7 years. I had already tried to arrange to become a discalced Carmelite priest. I had to change that plan when my father died, and so I was out in the world, and I was working as a translator. I was living in an apartment in Mount Rainier, Maryland, and I had a dream. And the dream was a particularly vivid one that stuck with me. In the dream, I was walking with a guy I'd known from grad school, a Jewish guy. And in the dream, although not in real life, in the dream, he was a Hasidic Jew. So he had the whole thing with the hat and the ringlets and the black cape and the black coat and whatever, the black overcoat sort of thing. And I was with him, on a farm in West Virginia, of all places. And I don't even know what we were talking about, whatever, but there was a ramshackled barn on the property where we were standing. And that ramshackle barn I knew was my home. And the next thing I knew, I was in that home. I was married. I had not met Judith yet at this point. But I was married, and I had a woman, the woman who was my wife was this very down-to-earth, strong, physically and emotionally and mentally, and just a strong person, a strong character, sort of red in the face and just, her body just sort of toughened and by hard labor, by hard work of living, and yet it was a good thing to be married, and it was good to be married to her, and we had a son in the dream. I remember an infant son, who in the dream then grows up and is drafted into the military and sent off to a war, and is killed in the war. And I lose my son in the dream. And then not long after that, my wife reports to me that she's done and she'll be leaving, and I lose my wife. And I'm looking out the window, and there is outside the window of this barn now a white frame New England church, which looks actually a lot like Faneuil Hall in Washington. Inside is a kind of sort of farmer's market, lots of stalls and so on, lots of good produce and lots of fresh fruits and vegetables and wonderful things. And they're loading that church, and that's my church. I just know in the dream that that's my church. They're loading that church onto the back of a trailer, onto a truck, and they take it away. They drive off with it. I've lost my church. And yet, each of these losses, each of these tragedies in the dream I'm able to weather them. They're hard, they're difficult, they're painful, and yet I weather them. I come out the other end of them. And in the very last scene in the dream, takes place in Northeast D.C., in the Brookland neighborhood of Northeast Washington, D.C., around the Catholic University area. And there's a high hill on which one of L'Enfant's original forts was placed. And I'm coming down out of the woods from that what's now a park, and it's fall, and it's a beautiful fall day, a lot like yesterday was. It was sunny. The weather was beautiful. It was a little crisp. The leaves were beautiful colors, and I don't dream in color usually, but the leaves were beautiful colors. And I have a big black Labrador dog, which was also a wonderful thing in this dream, because at that time I was quite allergic to dogs, and in some ways still am, I guess, but we managed to have our own without any trouble. But I in the dream had this big friendly black Labrador dog, and I'm walking down out of the woods, and I'm walking down to my favorite Christian bookstore, the Newman bookstore, and in the basement, which was in the basement of a building. And I go down to the Newman bookstore, and it's set up for a poetry reading. There are candles on stanchions, on candle stands around this big black table with this big box on it. And I'm too clueless to recognize as yet what that really signifies. But I go, and it's just like, this is good. This is right. This is everything that I have wanted. But I wake up from that dream feeling like $1 million. And that feeling stayed with me for months and years. And when I rehearse, when I review and think back on that dream, some of that still comes back to me. We will weather this. We will come out the other end, and when we finally say goodbye, we will be able to say that we have lived well, that we have accepted our sinfulness and we have accepted God's mercy, that we have accepted our own unlovableness, and yet the fact that we are loved, that we have not done all that we can. We have not loved God with our whole heart. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. We have been sorry. We have been repentant, and we still keep on doing it. And yet time and time again, God keeps faith with us. And time again, God bestows on us untold mercy, untold miracles of grace and good gifts and love. We will do this, It's not just a dream for me. It's a dream for all of us. We can get through whatever life throws at us. We already have. We have already survived 100% of our worst days. We can get through whatever else there is, and we can do it as we remain faithful to God's plan for our life. Not the one we think we can project outward into the future, but the actual plan God has for us to incorporate even the times of loss and hardship, even the times of strain, of disappointment, of frustration, of failure, of being failed, even the times of betrayal, the times of being attacked. We survive all of that under the watchful eye and the watchful hand and the protecting hand of God. So that's what I want to leave with you. That's the dream, and I'm going to keep dreaming it as we prepare to move forward, and as we look forward to resuming even our morning musings. I have mixed feelings, I have to say. I know there are things coming up when I'm going to say, "Oh, I can't wait to talk about this," at 10 o'clock. But I'm going to have to discipline myself to to make myself stand back a bit and rest. I will supply you with sources of inspiration, I hope, and maybe we'll pick up some other kinds of. I'll send you off to other writers, other blogs, other websites, perhaps, and maybe a collection of those. But I look forward to coming back to these things. I will continue to do our morning and evening prayers with you, and we will continue to try to find how God wants us to work out our worship together and our being together as a church. But in the meantime, please pray. Please pray, and pray for discernment, not only for yourself, but for our parish, and be part of that parish life, that parish prayer, that parish discernment. So I am going to leave you with that, and I will say not goodbye, but so long for now. And I will be praying for you and praying that God will grant you every blessing and every good gift until we meet again. Where's my...